There's a moment that arrives without warning, when the mask you've worn for decades suddenly feels like it's suffocating you, not metaphorically, literally. Your chest tightens during conversations that once flowed effortlessly. Small talk becomes physically uncomfortable, like your nervous system is rejecting it. This isn't depression, though it might feel similar. Ancient Egyptian wisdom keeper, Thoth, understood this phenomenon intimately, the soul's allergic reaction to falseness. Your being starts rejecting inauthenticity the way your body rejects poison. You'll find yourself standing at parties, surrounded by familiar faces, feeling like you're watching a play you can no longer participate in. Former ambitions feel hollow. Career goals that once motivated you now seem like someone else's dreams hanging in your closet. Thoth called this the great unmasking, when your consciousness begins dissolving the constructed reality you've inhabited. This awakening doesn't strike like lightning. It seeps through you like water through stone, fundamentally reshaping everything. If this resonates, you're experiencing the first of 7 profound shifts that spiritually awakening people undergo. The masks you wore so effortlessly before now feel like they're suffocating you from the inside out. This is where the real transformation begins, with the death of your approval addiction, that insatiable hunger that once drove every carefully calculated smile, every perfectly timed laugh, every opinion you shaped to match whoever stood in front of you. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That moment when someone tells a joke that isn't remotely funny, and your body simply refuses to produce that automatic laugh. Your face won't cooperate. The muscles that once responded instantly to social cues now feel frozen, authentic. You sit there in the awkward silence, and something profound has shifted. Your nervous system is literally rejecting the performance. This isn't a conscious choice you're making. It's deeper than that. Your entire physiological response to social situations is changing. The forced enthusiasm that once came so naturally now feels impossible to manufacture. When your boss launches into another motivational speech about company values you know are hollow, your body won't let you nod along anymore. Your face refuses to mirror their excitement. It's as if your authentic self is staging a rebellion at the cellular level. The shape-shifting that defined your social existence becomes increasingly difficult, then painful, then impossible. You used to be a social chameleon, conservative with your conservative friends, liberal with your liberal colleagues, spiritual with the yoga crowd, practical with your family. But now, maintaining these different versions of yourself feels like wearing clothes that no longer fit. The energy required to sustain these personas becomes exhausting because you're fighting against your own emerging authenticity. This creates a fascinating paradox in your daily interactions. You find yourself unable to agree with opinions that don't resonate with your inner truth, even when agreement would be socially advantageous. Your colleague expresses a viewpoint that you would have automatically supported before, and the words of agreement simply won't form. They get stuck somewhere between your authentic self and your social conditioning, creating an uncomfortable silence that speaks louder than any forced response ever could. The physical discomfort becomes undeniable when you try to impress others. Your chest tightens. Your breathing becomes shallow. Your voice sounds foreign to your own ears when you attempt to present a version of yourself designed for their approval. It's as if your body is equipped with a new authenticity detector that triggers alarm bells whenever you stray from your genuine self. This transformation reveals something profound about how approval addiction actually functions. For most of your life, you've been operating with an external compass, constantly checking the faces around you for validation, adjusting your behavior based on their reactions, measuring your worth through their responses. But spiritual awakening introduces you to an internal compass that operates on completely different principles. Your new internal compass doesn't care about applause or approval. It points toward truth, authenticity, alignment with your deeper values. When you follow this internal guidance, you feel centered and grounded. When you ignore it in favor of external validation, you feel fragmented and depleted. The contrast becomes so stark that choosing authenticity over approval becomes less of a decision and more of a survival instinct. But this transition isn't without its challenges. You find yourself caught between two worlds, no longer addicted to approval but not yet comfortable without it. The loneliness can be overwhelming. Social situations that once energized you now drain you. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly now feel stilted and artificial. You're discovering that many of your relationships were built on mutual performance rather than genuine connection. Some of the deeper teachings about breaking free from approval addiction are too profound for public platforms. That's why we share the most transformative insights exclusively through our free Insights Academy newsletter, where you'll also receive a complimentary copy of the Kybalion for a limited time. This period of social awkwardness is actually a necessary part of your evolution. You're learning to distinguish between the false self that seeks validation and the true self that simply exists. Thoth's teachings illuminate this distinction beautifully. The false self is like a performer on a stage, constantly adjusting its act based on audience reaction. The true self is like the sun. It shines not because it seeks approval, but because shining is its nature. Your relationships begin to shift in unexpected ways. Some people become uncomfortable with your newfound authenticity. They miss the version of you that mirrored their energy, agreed with their opinions, laughed at their jokes. Your refusal to perform these social rituals can trigger their own insecurities about authenticity. They might accuse you of becoming arrogant, antisocial, or difficult, when in reality you've simply stopped being a reflection of their expectations. Other relationships deepen in ways you never imagined possible. When you stop performing, you create space for others to drop their masks too. Conversations become more meaningful. Connections feel more genuine. You discover that authentic vulnerability is far more magnetic than any carefully crafted persona you ever maintained. The paradox of losing your need for approval is that it often makes you more genuinely attractive to others. When you're not trying to impress anyone, your natural charisma emerges. When you're not seeking validation, your self-assurance becomes evident. When you're not performing, your authenticity draws people who resonate with your true frequency. This doesn't happen overnight. There's a learning curve to operating from internal rather than external validation. You'll catch yourself slipping back into old patterns, automatically adjusting your energy to match those around you. But now you notice these moments of inauthenticity immediately. Your body sends clear signals when you're betraying your true self, making it increasingly difficult to sustain the old patterns. The death of approval addiction marks the birth of something far more valuable, authentic self-worth that doesn't fluctuate based on external recognition. You begin to understand that seeking approval is actually a form of spiritual poverty, a constant outsourcing of your power to others. True spiritual wealth comes from recognizing that your worth is inherent, not earned through performance or validated through others' opinions. This foundational shift in how you relate to approval sets the stage for all the other transformations that follow in your spiritual awakening journey. There's something deeply unsettling that happens when you first realize how much energy you've been pouring into being special. It hits you like a cold wave. This recognition that so much of what you thought was authentic spiritual growth was actually just another performance, another way of seeking the very approval you thought you'd moved beyond. I remember watching someone at a meditation retreat casually mention they'd studied with a famous teacher, then seamlessly drop the names of 3 spiritual books they'd integrated, followed by a subtle reference to their morning practice routine. The whole conversation was choreographed, each revelation designed to establish their position in some invisible hierarchy of consciousness. And the strangest part? I recognized myself in that performance. This need to be special runs so deep in our culture that we barely notice it anymore. From childhood, we're trained to stand out, be the best student, the most talented, the most insightful. Social media has weaponized this impulse, turning every moment into potential proof of our uniqueness. We photograph our meditation corners, quote, spiritual texts with careful attribution, and craft posts about our latest breakthrough or download from the universe. But something shifts as genuine awakening deepens. You start growing quieter about your achievements. That book that completely transformed your understanding, you might not even mention it. The profound realization you had during meditation, it stays private, integrated silently into how you move through the world rather than becoming content for your next conversation. This shift terrifies the ego. If I'm not special, then who am I? If I can't distinguish myself through my spiritual insights, my unique perspective, my advanced understanding, then what's left? The fear runs deeper than just losing social status. It feels like losing identity itself. Watch how this specialness addiction shows up in spiritual circles. There's the subtle competition about who meditates longer, who's read more obscure texts, who has the most dramatic awakening story. People name-drop their teachers like spiritual credentials. They perform profundity, crafting insights that sound deep rather than sharing what's actually moving through them. They announce their discoveries with the breathless excitement of someone who needs witnesses to validate their growth. The exhaustion of maintaining specialness is staggering. It requires constant vigilance, monitoring how others perceive you, calculating the impact of your words, curating your image to maintain that sense of being somehow above or beyond the ordinary masses. Your shoulders literally carry the weight of this performance. There's a tension that lives in your body when you're constantly trying to appear significant. I've seen people abandon entire spiritual practices once they realize those practices have become about appearing advanced rather than genuine transformation. The meditation practice that was supposed to bring peace becomes another source of anxiety. Am I doing it right? Am I progressing fast enough? How do I communicate my progress without seeming like I'm bragging? But here's where something beautiful emerges from this death of specialness. The less you try to stand out, the more genuinely radiant you become. It's like watching a flower bloom, not because it wants to impress the passing gardener, but because blooming is simply its nature expressing itself. When you stop performing spirituality and start living it, your authentic uniqueness finally has space to emerge. But this uniqueness isn't something you manufacture or display. It's not a product of effort or intention. It arises naturally when all the artificial layers of specialness fall away. This shift completely changes how you engage on social media. Instead of crafting posts designed to showcase your spiritual sophistication, you might share something simple and real, a moment of genuine gratitude, a struggle you're working through, or nothing at all. The compulsion to document your growth for public consumption simply fades. Your conversations transform too. Instead of steering discussions toward topics where you can demonstrate your knowledge, you become genuinely curious about others' experiences. You ask questions not to set up your own insights, but because you're actually interested in the answers. You stop treating conversations as opportunities to establish your spiritual credentials. Thoth speaks of this as the difference between the ego's illusions and the soul's natural expression. The ego believes it must prove its worth, establish its specialness, earn its place through performance. The soul knows its inherent value and expresses itself authentically without needing external validation or recognition. There's a profound relief when this weight lifts from your shoulders. Literally, people often describe a physical sensation of lightness when they stop trying to maintain their special status. The chronic tension of performance dissolves. You can finally relax into simply being yourself. This doesn't mean becoming invisible or suppressing your gifts. Healthy self-expression continues, but it's no longer driven by the need to appear special. You share your insights when they're genuinely helpful, not when you need to prove your wisdom. You discuss your experiences when it serves the conversation, not when you need to establish your credentials. The paradox is extraordinary. Embracing your ordinariness makes life itself extraordinary. When you're not constantly performing specialness, you have energy available for actually experiencing the profound mystery of existence. When you stop trying to be spiritually impressive, you can finally be spiritually authentic. Notice this week where the need to be special still operates in your life, and feel the relief that comes from letting even one small performance go. The spiritual community has a dirty little secret, and it's exhausting millions of people who are just trying to find their authentic path. We've created this unspoken rule that awakened people must radiate positivity at all times, that true spirituality means wearing a perpetual smile and speaking only in affirmations. But here's what actually happens during genuine spiritual awakening. You start recognizing this forced positivity for what it really is. Another performance, another mask, another way of abandoning yourself to meet others' expectations. Think about the last time someone asked how you were doing when you were genuinely struggling. Did you automatically respond with, "I'm fine," or "I'm blessed," even though your heart felt heavy? That automatic response isn't spirituality, it's conditioning. We've been taught that admitting to sadness, frustration, or confusion somehow makes us less evolved, less awakened, less worthy of being in spiritual spaces. I remember watching a woman at a spiritual retreat force herself to smile through tears during a meditation circle. When someone asked if she was okay, she immediately switched to this bright, artificial voice. "Oh yes, I'm just feeling so much gratitude for this beautiful experience." Meanwhile, her body language screamed exhaustion and grief. She'd learned that her authentic emotions weren't welcome in spiritual spaces, unless they were packaged in gratitude and light. This is spiritual bypassing disguised as enlightenment, and it's incredibly damaging. When you're awakening, you begin to notice how much energy it takes to maintain this facade of endless positivity. You realize you've been performing happiness instead of actually feeling it, reciting affirmations you don't believe while your inner world remains unhealed. True awakening brings a profound shift. You stop performing emotions and start experiencing them fully. This means allowing yourself to feel disappointed when someone lets you down, instead of immediately jumping to, "everything happens for a reason." It means sitting with sadness when it arises, without rushing to transform it into a lesson or blessing. It means expressing frustration honestly instead of coating it in spiritual platitudes. The people around you who are used to your performance of positivity often react with shock when you become emotionally authentic. They might say things like, "You used to be so positive," or "I thought you were more spiritual than this." These reactions reveal how much they were relying on your emotional labor, your constant sunshine, to brighten their own difficult moments. But here's what's fascinating: when you stop forcing positivity, a different kind of light emerges. It's not the blinding glare of performed happiness, but the gentle, steady glow of authenticity. People start trusting you more because they sense you're real. They begin sharing their own struggles because they know you won't immediately try to fix them with toxic positivity. I've seen this transformation in countless people. There's a woman I know who spent years in spiritual circles always being the light person, the one who could find the silver lining in any tragedy, who never had a bad day, who radiated what everyone thought was enlightenment. When she finally allowed herself to express genuine grief over her father's death without wrapping it in spiritual bypass language, something remarkable happened. People started approaching her with their real problems instead of just their surface-level concerns. Her authentic sorrow was more healing and inspiring than years of forced smiles had ever been. This connects directly to ancient wisdom traditions, including the teachings attributed to Thoth, which emphasize the wholeness of human experience. True wisdom isn't about transcending emotions, it's about integrating them fully. Every emotion carries information, energy, and purpose. When we deny our full emotional spectrum, we're actually denying parts of our humanity that are sacred and necessary for growth. In daily interactions, this emotional authenticity looks different for everyone. Maybe you stop automatically saying, "no worries," when someone genuinely inconveniences you. Perhaps you allow silence when someone asks how you're doing and you don't have anything positive to share. You might express disappointment about a friend's behavior without immediately adding, "but I still love them," to soften the impact. The fear that people will reject the real you is often overblown. Yes, some people who were addicted to your performed positivity might drift away. But these weren't authentic connections anyway. They were based on your willingness to be their emotional support system while denying your own needs. The relationships that remain and deepen when you become emotionally honest are the ones worth keeping. What's particularly powerful about embracing your full emotional spectrum is how it affects your spiritual practice. Instead of meditating to achieve some blissful state, you meditate to be present with whatever arises. Instead of praying for problems to disappear, you pray for the wisdom to navigate them authentically. Your spirituality becomes grounded in reality rather than floating in performed transcendence. This doesn't mean becoming negative or wallowing in difficult emotions. It means treating all emotions as temporary visitors that deserve acknowledgement and respect. When you're angry, you feel it fully without judgment. Learn what it's teaching you, and let it move through you naturally. When you're sad, you honor that sadness as a response to loss or disappointment, allowing it to soften your heart rather than harden it. The paradox is that when you stop trying to be positive all the time, you actually experience more genuine joy and peace. These emotions arise naturally from authentic living rather than from forced performance. If this resonates with your own experience of moving beyond fake positivity, share this with someone who might need permission to feel their emotions fully. Your emotional authenticity becomes a gift to the world, not because you're always happy, but because you're always real. In a culture drowning in performed emotions and spiritual bypassing, your willingness to be genuinely human is revolutionary. There's a moment in spiritual awakening when everything you thought you knew starts to crumble. and it's terrifying. You've built your entire sense of self on certainties, your beliefs, your opinions, your carefully constructed worldview. Then suddenly, like sand through your fingers, it all begins to slip away. I remember talking to someone who described this perfectly. She said, "I woke up one morning and realized I didn't know who I was anymore. Not my political views, not my spiritual beliefs, not even what I wanted for breakfast. It felt like standing on the edge of an abyss." This is what happens when the prison of certainty begins to crack open. For most of our lives, certainty feels like safety. We collect beliefs like armor, building walls of knowing around ourselves. We have firm opinions about politics, relationships, spirituality, success, everything. These fixed positions become our identity. We're the liberal or the conservative, the optimist or the realist, the spiritual seeker or the practical materialist. But as consciousness expands, something profound shifts. Those tidy explanations that once brought comfort start feeling like straitjackets. You begin to sense that life is too alive, too mysterious, too vast to be pinned down by your mental categories. The awakening soul starts to feel claustrophobic inside the walls of absolute knowing. What once felt like solid ground now feels like quicksand. The terror comes first. When you've built your entire sense of security on knowing who you are and what you believe, releasing that grip feels like psychological death. Your mind screams in protest. It wants to rebuild those walls immediately, to grasp onto new certainties to replace the old ones. But something deeper in you resists. You've tasted the freedom that lies beyond the need to know everything, and despite the fear, you can't go back. This shows up in surprisingly mundane ways. You find yourself in conversations where you used to have strong opinions, and suddenly you're saying, "I don't know," not as defeat, but as honest acknowledgement. Someone asks about your 5-year plan, and instead of the detailed blueprint you once would have provided, you shrug and say, "I'm curious to see what unfolds." Your relationship with beliefs transforms completely. Where you once held firm positions, you now hold space for multiple perspectives simultaneously. You can see the truth in opposing viewpoints without needing to choose sides. This isn't relativism or intellectual confusion. It's a deeper recognition that reality is far more complex and nuanced than any single perspective can capture. I've watched people go through this transition, and it's fascinating to observe. They'll be in the middle of explaining something they believe, then stop mid-sentence and laugh. "Actually, I have no idea if that's true," they'll say, and there's joy in that admission, not anxiety. They've discovered something that runs deeper than certainty, wonder. Thoth understood this profoundly. The ancient wisdom traditions speak of the limitations of the rational mind, not to dismiss logic, but to recognize its proper place. The mind is a magnificent tool for navigating practical reality, but it becomes a prison when we mistake its maps for the actual territory. The divine mystery is too vast, too alive, too paradoxical to be contained within any conceptual framework. This doesn't mean abandoning discernment or becoming gullible. There's a crucial difference between healthy discernment and the ego's desperate need for absolute certainty. Discernment says, based on available information, this seems most likely. The ego's certainty says, this is absolutely true, and anyone who disagrees is wrong. One leaves room for new information and changing perspectives, the other builds walls. Living without certainty transforms how you make decisions. Instead of rigid planning based on predicted outcomes, you learn to move with intuitive flow. You make choices from a deeper place of knowing, not the mind's knowing, but the soul's recognition of what feels aligned in this moment. Your decisions become more fluid, more responsive to the actual conditions of life, rather than your mental projections about what should happen. This shift is like becoming a child again. Watch a 3-year-old encounter something new, their eyes wide with wonder, no preconceptions clouding their perception. They don't need to categorize and file away every experience. They can simply be present with what is, astonished by the mystery of existence itself. The peace that emerges in this space goes deeper than any security that certainty ever provided. Certainty is brittle. It breaks when reality doesn't conform to expectations. But wonder is flexible, resilient. It can hold paradox, contradiction, and mystery without breaking. It finds beauty in the questions themselves, not just in having answers. Your mind will protest this transition intensely. It's designed to create order, to build models of reality that help you navigate the world. When you stop feeding it the certainty it craves, it can feel like you're starving an essential part of yourself. But gradually, you realize you're not losing anything essential, you're gaining everything. You're trading the small, cramped certainty of the ego for the vast, open mystery of existence itself. Life becomes a dance rather than a puzzle to solve. Each moment reveals its own quiet perfection. Not because you understand it, but because you're present with it. You stop trying to figure out the choreography in advance and learn to feel the rhythm, to respond to the music as it plays. The fears about living without certainty often prove to be illusions themselves. How will I make good decisions, you wonder? But you discover that decisions made from presence and intuitive wisdom are often far superior to those made from rigid mental planning. How will I know what's true? But you realize that truth is alive, dynamic, contextual, not a fixed position to be defended, but a living reality to be danced with. If this resonates with your own journey of releasing the need for certainty, share your experience in the comments. This transformation touches something essential in the awakening process, the courage to live in the questions rather than demanding answers from every moment. There's a moment in every awakening journey when you realize you've been carrying invisible chains, not the ones placed on you by others, but the ones you've forged yourself through blame. It's perhaps the most liberating discovery you'll make, and ironically the most terrifying for your ego to face. After releasing the need for fake positivity and the prison of certainty, something even more profound begins to shift. You start questioning the stories you've been telling yourself about who did what to whom and why your life unfolded the way it did. The victim narratives that once felt so real, so justified, begin to feel transparent. Let me be clear about something crucial here. This isn't about denying that harm occurred. Real wounds exist. Real betrayals happened. Real injustices were committed. The shift isn't about pretending otherwise or excusing anyone's behavior. It's about recognizing that blame, that toxic cocktail of resentment, righteousness, and powerlessness no longer serves your evolution. There's an ancient saying that perfectly captures this. Holding on to blame is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. You've probably felt this truth in your bones. That burning sensation when you replay old hurts, the way your body contracts when certain names come up, the mental energy consumed by rehearsing what you should have said or what they should have done differently. But here's what changes during awakening. Instead of asking, who's to blame for this? You start asking different questions. What is life showing me here? What is this pain pointing toward? What part of me is still seeking healing through this experience? I remember working with someone who'd spent 15 years blaming her ex-husband for ruining her ability to trust. 15 years of carrying that story, wearing it like armor. Then one day she noticed something startling. Every relationship since had followed an eerily similar pattern. The same betrayal, the same abandonment, just different faces. The awakening question hit her like lightning. What if this isn't about them? What if this pattern is showing me something about myself I haven't been willing to see? This is where the real work begins. When you stop pointing fingers long enough to examine your own hand, you discover something remarkable. The people who wounded you weren't random accidents. They were precise mirrors, reflecting back parts of your psyche you'd kept hidden even from yourself. Your ego absolutely hates this realization. It wants to stay righteous, to keep the stories alive, to maintain the familiar identity of the one who was wronged. There's a strange comfort in victimhood. It keeps you small, yes, but it also keeps you safe from the terrifying responsibility of your own power. Thoth spoke extensively about the law of correspondence. As above, so below. As within, so without. Your external experiences aren't random events happening to you. They're precise reflections of your internal landscape. The angry boss mirrors your own unacknowledged rage. The abandoning partner reflects the ways you've abandoned yourself. The critical parent echoes the voice in your own head. This doesn't mean you caused your trauma or that you deserved mistreatment. It means that on some level, your soul attracted these experiences to show you where healing was needed, where growth was calling, where old patterns were ready to be transformed. I've watched people have profound breakthroughs when they shift from, why did this happen to me, to, how did this serve my evolution? A woman who'd been sexually abused as a child eventually recognized that her journey through that darkness had given her an extraordinary capacity for compassion and a calling to help other survivors. The betrayal that felt like it would destroy her became the catalyst for discovering her life's purpose. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process of catching yourself in blame patterns and gently redirecting your attention. When you feel that familiar surge of resentment, you pause and ask, what is this feeling trying to teach me? What boundary do I need to establish? What part of me needs healing? You start seeing conflicts as teachers rather than attacks. That person who triggers you isn't your enemy. They're your guru in disguise, showing you exactly where your remaining attachments live. The situation that makes you feel powerless isn't a trap. It's an invitation to discover your authentic strength. The freedom that emerges from this shift is absolutely astonishing. When you're no longer giving other people power over your emotional state, when you're no longer waiting for apologies or acknowledgements to feel whole, when you're no longer defining yourself by what was done to you, you become the author of your own life. This doesn't mean becoming a doormat or abandoning healthy boundaries. In fact, the opposite happens. When you're not operating from a place of blame and reactivity, your boundaries become clearer, stronger, more natural. You can say no without anger, leave without drama, protect yourself without attacking others. You begin to see even those who wounded you with different eyes. Not as monsters or enemies, but as unconscious souls playing out their own unhealed patterns. This doesn't mean you have to maintain relationships with harmful people, but it means you can release them without carrying their poison in your system. The most profound shift happens when you realize that everything, every betrayal, every loss, every moment of suffering, has been perfectly orchestrated by your soul's wisdom to bring you to this moment of awakening. The very experiences you once cursed become the ones you're most grateful for, because they cracked you open enough to let the light in. If this resonates with something you're ready to release, comment "I am free" below. Sometimes declaring your liberation is the first step toward claiming it. This is where real spiritual maturity begins, not in transcending your humanity, but in taking full responsibility for your experience while still honoring the reality of what occurred. It's the difference between being a victim of your story and being the conscious author of your transformation. There's a moment in spiritual awakening when the ground beneath your feet becomes more sacred than the clouds you once tried to escape to. It's jarring, this realization that everything you thought spirituality was supposed to do, lift you above the mess of being human, was actually keeping you from the very awakening you sought. I remember watching someone in a meditation group years ago, tears streaming down their face during a particularly intense session. Instead of allowing the emotion, they immediately straightened their posture, regulated their breathing, and went deeper into their practice. "I'm transcending this," they whispered. But what I witnessed wasn't transcendence, it was spiritual bypassing in real time, using the very tools meant to connect them with truth as a sophisticated form of avoidance. This is what Thoth understood when he spoke of the marriage between spirit and matter. He wasn't teaching escape from the physical realm, but integration with it. The awakening soul discovers that every attempt to float above human experience is actually a rejection of the very vehicle through which consciousness explores itself. The signs of spiritual bypassing are everywhere once you recognize them. There's the person who responds to every tragedy with "everything happens for a reason," effectively shutting down any genuine processing of grief or injustice. There's the meditator who sits for hours not to deepen awareness, but to avoid feeling the loneliness that surfaces when they stop moving. There's the spiritual seeker who speaks eloquently about love and light, while their unprocessed anger leaks out in passive-aggressive comments and righteous judgment. I've seen people use mantras like emotional anesthesia, chanting their way past the very feelings that contain their deepest wisdom. They'll quote ancient texts about detachment, while using that philosophy to avoid the vulnerability of actually caring about anything. They'll talk about surrendering to divine will while refusing to surrender to the simple human experience of not knowing what to do next. But here's what happens when you try to spiritually bypass your humanity: your soul rebels. It places you in situations that make avoidance impossible. The meditation that once provided escape suddenly becomes a spotlight on everything you've been running from. The spiritual practices that used to lift you above your problems start pushing you deeper into them. The mantras that once soothed your anxiety begin to feel hollow, even irritating. This rebellion isn't punishment, it's grace. Your soul knows that the very experiences you're trying to transcend contain the keys to genuine awakening. That anger you keep trying to breathe away, it might be pointing to boundaries you need to establish. That sadness you're attempting to meditate past, it could be grief that needs to be honored, not healed. That desire you're trying to detach from, perhaps it's your soul's way of calling you towards something essential. The awakening process gradually makes spiritual bypassing impossible because it reveals a fundamental truth. Being human isn't the obstacle to enlightenment, it's the doorway. Your body isn't a prison housing your spirit. It's the sacred temple where spirit experiences itself in form. Your emotions aren't disturbances to be transcended. They're the language through which your soul communicates with your conscious mind. When you stop trying to escape your humanity, something extraordinary happens. You discover that feeling your anger fully, without suppressing or acting out, connects you to a fierce clarity about what matters. You find that experiencing desire without shame reveals the creative force of the universe moving through you. You learn that sitting with sadness without rushing to transform it opens you to a tenderness that can hold all of life's contradictions. This is what grounded spirituality looks like. It means feeling the full spectrum of human emotion while remaining connected to something larger than your personal drama. It means engaging with your psychological wounds not as spiritual failures, but as doorways to compassion. It means recognizing that your most challenging human experiences often contain your greatest spiritual teachings. Thoth taught that spirit and matter are not separate realms, but different expressions of the same fundamental reality. When you truly grasp this, you stop trying to choose between being spiritual and being human. You realize they're the same thing approached from different angles. Your spirituality becomes embodied, practical, real. The temptation to escape remains, of course. When life gets particularly challenging, part of you still wants to retreat into spiritual concepts that promise to lift you above the mess. But the awakened soul recognizes this impulse and gently redirects. Instead of using meditation to avoid difficult feelings, you meditate to be more present with them. Instead of using spiritual philosophy to bypass personal responsibility, you use it to engage more consciously with your choices and their consequences. This integration creates a spirituality that's both more humble and more powerful than the transcendent version. You become someone who can hold space for both joy and sorrow, who can be deeply spiritual while remaining thoroughly human. You discover that touching your own fear, longing, and grief with awareness is actually touching the living pulse of the universe itself. If this resonates with your own journey from spiritual bypassing to embodied awakening, share your experience in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to stop running from their own sacred humanity. The path forward isn't up and out, it's down and in, into the rich soil of your actual life where real transformation takes root. There's a peculiar loneliness that accompanies the early stages of awakening. You start seeing through the scripts everyone seems to be reading from, and suddenly you feel like you're watching a movie where everyone else is still convinced they're living real life. The conversations at family dinners feel hollow. Your co-workers' complaints about their weekend plans or their latest purchase seem to come from a different planet. You find yourself nodding along to discussions that feel increasingly meaningless, all while a voice in your head whispers, "How can they not see what I'm seeing?" This isolation isn't imaginary. It's one of the most challenging aspects of spiritual awakening that nobody talks about honestly. You genuinely do start perceiving reality differently, and that creates a gap between you and the people who used to feel familiar. The temptation becomes overwhelming to retreat into spiritual communities, online forums, or books where someone finally speaks your language. But here's where awakening gets really interesting. Eventually, it starts dissolving even this separation. I remember spending months feeling like I was carrying around some cosmic secret that nobody wanted to hear about. Family gatherings became exercises in patience. I'd watch my relatives debate politics or gossip about neighbors, and I'd feel this mixture of compassion and frustration. If they could just see beyond this surface-level drama, I'd think they'd realize none of this matters the way they think it does. The superiority was subtle but unmistakable. I had awakened, and they were still asleep. This phase feels necessary, even protective. When you're first recognizing the patterns that kept you unconscious, you need some distance to integrate what you're discovering. But Thoth's teachings point towards something far more profound than permanent separation from unawakened people. The isolation phase is actually preparing you for a much deeper recognition, the extraordinary ordinariness of awakened presence. The shift happens gradually, then all at once. You're standing in line at the grocery store, and the cashier, who's probably never read a spiritual book in her life, makes eye contact and smiles with such genuine warmth that you suddenly see yourself reflected back. Not your spiritual identity or your awakened insights, but something more fundamental. The simple presence that exists before any story about being awakened or asleep, evolved or unconscious. You start noticing these moments everywhere. The construction worker who waves you through traffic with such natural patience that you glimpse the Buddha nature spiritual teachers spend years describing. Your elderly neighbor who's never heard of mindfulness but tends his garden with the kind of present moment awareness that meditation retreats try to cultivate. Your teenage nephew who, between complaints about school and excitement about video games, drops some observation about life that cuts straight to the heart of what you've been trying to understand through years of spiritual seeking. The recognition dawns slowly. Awakening isn't about becoming someone special or different. It's about recognizing what was already present in everyone, including the people you thought were asleep. The difference isn't that you have something they lack. It's that you've stopped believing certain stories about yourself and reality that were creating the illusion of separation. This realization completely transforms how you show up in relationships. Instead of trying to wake people up or share your spiritual insights, you start meeting them exactly where they are. Your mother's anxiety about your career choices stops triggering your need to explain how attachment creates suffering. Instead, you hear the love underneath her worry and respond to that. Your friend's materialism stops feeling like evidence of their unconsciousness. You start seeing their desire for security and beauty, which isn't fundamentally different from anyone's longing for peace and fulfillment. The conversations change because you change. When you stop needing people to understand your spiritual journey, they often become more curious about the peace they sense in your presence. When you stop judging their concerns as unspiritual, they start sharing more vulnerable parts of themselves. The connection you are seeking through shared spiritual interests starts happening through simple human presence. This doesn't mean you lose discernment or pretend all perspectives are equally helpful. You still recognize unconscious patterns both in yourself and others. But you stop making those patterns mean something definitive about someone's worth or spiritual potential. You've seen how quickly awareness can shift, how the person who seems most stuck can suddenly demonstrate profound wisdom, how the people you dismissed as superficial often carry depths you never suspected. The workplace becomes a different kind of spiritual practice. Instead of feeling frustrated by office politics or small talk, you start seeing these interactions as opportunities to practice conscious presence. You discover that genuine interest in your colleagues' weekend plans can create more authentic connection than trying to steer conversations toward meaningful topics. The receptionist who seems scattered and distracted might share something about her life that reveals remarkable resilience and wisdom. Family relationships often undergo the most dramatic transformation. The relatives who used to trigger your spiritual superiority become teachers in disguise. Your uncle's stubborn political opinions start looking less like ignorance and more like his attempt to make sense of a confusing world. Your sister's focus on her children's achievements stops seeming like unconscious competition and starts looking like love expressing itself through the forms available to her. The fear that haunted your isolation phase, that connecting with unawakened people would somehow compromise your spiritual progress, reveals itself as another form of spiritual ego. You discover that presence doesn't need protection. Consciousness doesn't become less conscious by engaging with unconsciousness. In fact, the opposite happens. Your awakening becomes more stable and authentic through genuine human connection. This reconnection with humanity becomes the real fruit of spiritual awakening. Love stops being an abstract spiritual concept and becomes your natural way of meeting whatever appears. Not the conditional love that depends on people sharing your interests or understanding your journey, but the unconditional recognition of shared being that exists before any story about who's awake and who's asleep. If this resonates with your experience of moving from spiritual isolation back into authentic human connection, share your story in the comments below. The path from separation back to unity through genuine presence is one of awakening's most beautiful paradoxes. and your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. The ancient Egyptian wisdom keepers understood something profound about transformation that we're only beginning to grasp today. They knew that spiritual awakening isn't a single moment of enlightenment. It's a gradual process of shedding, like a snake releasing skin that no longer fits. When you look back at what we've explored, the hunger for approval, the desperate need to feel special, the exhausting performance of happiness, the white-knuckle grip on certainty, the endless blame games, the spiritual bypassing, and those walls of isolation, you start to see a pattern. These aren't random behaviors you decide to quit one Tuesday morning. They fall away naturally, the way autumn leaves release from branches when their time has come. Here's what nobody tells you about this process. It feels like dying, not once, but over and over again. Each identity you've constructed around these patterns crumbles, and for a moment, you don't know who you are anymore. The people pleaser dies. The spiritual perfectionist dies. The victim dies. The superior awakened one dies. Each death feels real because, in a sense, it is. I remember working with someone who described it perfectly. She said, "I keep waking up not recognizing myself. Yesterday, I would have twisted myself into knots to avoid disappointing my mother. Today, I simply said, no, and it felt completely natural. But then I panicked. If I'm not the good daughter, who am I?" This is where Thoth's teachings become invaluable. The ancient texts speak of spiritual death and rebirth not as metaphor, but as the fundamental rhythm of consciousness expanding. Each pattern you release isn't actually part of you. It's clothing you put on so long ago you forgot you were wearing it. When it becomes too tight, too heavy, too false, it simply falls away. The paradox is staggering. You're not losing yourself. You're finding yourself. You're not becoming someone new. You're uncovering who you've always been beneath all those protective layers. It's like an archaeologist carefully brushing away centuries of sediment to reveal the pristine artifact underneath. But here's where most people get confused about the process. They think awakening should feel good, like a steady upward trajectory toward bliss. Instead, it often feels like being tumbled by ocean waves. You think you've released your need for approval, then find yourself checking your phone obsessively after posting something vulnerable. You believe you've transcended spiritual bypassing, then catch yourself dismissing someone's pain with empty platitudes about choosing your vibration. This back and forth isn't failure. It's the natural rhythm of transformation. Think of waves approaching a shore. They don't crash once and reshape the coastline. They come in and retreat, each time carrying away a little more sand, until gradually the entire landscape changes. Your old patterns work the same way. They return, but each time with less power, less conviction, until one day you notice they've simply stopped coming. The key insight that changes everything is this: you're not actually doing the quitting. Life is doing it through you. You don't wake up and decide to stop seeking approval. You simply find that the old desperate hunger has faded. You don't choose to release your need for specialness. You discover that the compulsion to be different has quietly dissolved. This is why forcing the process never works. I've watched people try to muscle their way through awakening, gritting their teeth and declaring, "I will not seek approval anymore." But transformation that's forced is just another form of spiritual violence. It creates internal war rather than natural evolution. The ancient wisdom traditions understood this deeply. They spoke of surrender not as giving up, but as aligning with the current that was already flowing. You don't create the river, you stop fighting it. You don't manufacture the awakening, you stop clinging to what's being washed away. When you're in the thick of this process, the discomfort can be overwhelming. There are nights when you feel completely unmoored, like you're floating in space with no reference points. The old you is dissolving, but the new you hasn't fully emerged. Friends and family might not recognize you anymore. You might not recognize yourself. This liminal space, this threshold between who you were and who you're becoming, is actually sacred. Indigenous cultures have elaborate rituals around these transition periods because they understood that this is when the real transformation happens. Not in the dramatic moments of revelation, but in the quiet spaces between identities. The loneliness during this phase is particularly intense because you're releasing the very strategies you used to connect with others. If you bonded with people through complaining, what happens when blame patterns dissolve? If you connected through spiritual concepts, what happens when bypassing falls away? You have to learn entirely new ways of relating, and that learning happens in the awkward, vulnerable space of not yet knowing how. But here's the profound truth that emerges. As each false layer falls away, what remains is more authentically you than anything you've ever known. The approval seeking wasn't you, it was a strategy. The spiritual performance wasn't you, it was protection. The isolation wasn't you, it was fear, wearing a mask of superiority. What you discover underneath all those patterns is something unshakable, not because it's hard or defended, but because it's so fundamentally true that it needs no protection. It's like finding bedrock after digging through layers of soil. The bedrock doesn't try to be solid. Solidity is its nature. This is why the process requires such gentle patience with yourself. You're not walking a path toward awakening. You're being carried by a current that knows exactly where it's going. Your job isn't to navigate or control, but to trust the intelligence that's orchestrating this unfolding. If you're recognizing this process in your own life, trust it. The deaths are real, but so is what's being born. Each pattern that falls away creates space for something more authentic to emerge. You're not falling apart, you're falling into truth. The rhythm of awakening is ultimately the rhythm of life itself. Expansion and contraction, death and birth, shedding and emerging. When you stop fighting this natural pulse and start moving with it, the transformation becomes not just bearable, but beautiful. If you're watching this and feeling like pieces of your life are crumbling away, I want you to understand something profound. You're not falling apart, you're finally coming together. Maybe you've noticed friendships that once felt essential now feel like performances you can no longer sustain. Perhaps career ambitions that used to drive you forward now feel hollow, like chasing mirages in a desert you no longer want to cross. The masks you've worn so skillfully for years might feel suffocating now, like clothes that no longer fit the person you're becoming. This isn't loss, this is revelation. Thoth taught that beneath every false identity lies an eternal truth so luminous that once glimpsed, it transforms everything. What you're experiencing isn't destruction, it's archaeology. You're excavating the real you from beneath layers of conditioning, expectation, and learned behavior that were never actually yours to begin with. I remember working with someone who described this process perfectly. She said it felt like being an actor who suddenly forgot all her lines in the middle of a play she never auditioned for. The panic was real, but so was the relief. For the first time, in decades, she didn't know what to say or do, and in that unknowing, something authentic finally had space to breathe. This is what remains when the false layers fall away, a self so unshakably real that it needs no audience, no applause, no external validation to exist. It simply is. And once you taste this authenticity, you discover something remarkable. You can never again trade it for approval or certainty. It becomes impossible. The luminous self that emerges doesn't perform. It doesn't chase, it doesn't prove. It exists with the quiet confidence of a mountain or the effortless flow of a river. This isn't arrogance, it's the natural state of being that isn't constantly defending itself against imaginary threats or competing for limited resources of love and acceptance. Thoth's deepest teachings point to this unchanging essence within us. While everything external shifts, relationships, circumstances, even our thoughts and emotions, this core self remains constant. It's not something you become, it's something you remember you've always been. When you align with this truth, life becomes remarkably different, lighter, simpler, more fluid. You stop fighting currents you never needed to resist and discover that the river of existence was carrying you all along. You just hadn't learned to trust it yet. But let's be honest about what this process feels like. The discomfort is real. The loneliness can be profound. Sometimes it feels like dying, and in a way, it is. The person you thought you were, with all their strategies and stories and carefully constructed defenses, is dissolving. This can feel terrifying until you realize what's being born in its place. What emerges is a life so vivid and free that the old existence seems like watching television with the color turned down. You discover energy you didn't know you had because you're no longer spending it maintaining false versions of yourself. Relationships become deeper or naturally fade away, but either way, they become real. Work becomes expression rather than survival. Even challenges feel different because you're meeting them as yourself rather than as who you think you should be. The most profound recognition comes when you realize that the self you thought you were, the achiever, the seeker, the victim, the performer, was only a mask. Beneath it, you were already whole. You were already free. You were already enough. The search was the only thing keeping you from what you were seeking. This is what awakening actually is, not becoming enlightened, but recognizing what was never actually hidden. It's like suddenly noticing you've been wearing sunglasses indoors and taking them off. The light was always there. You just forgot you were filtering it. Once this recognition happens, something irreversible occurs. You cannot unsee what you've seen. Life never again allows you to return to sleep, though it might occasionally let you pretend. But the pretending becomes increasingly uncomfortable because you know the difference now between performing life and living it. The most beautiful realization is this: you were never missing anything. You were never broken. You never needed fixing or improving or becoming someone else. You only forgot who you were, like an actor who stayed in character so long they forgot their real name. This remembering is true freedom. Not the freedom to become someone else, but the freedom to stop pretending to be someone you're not. It's the difference between wearing a costume and taking it off. Both require effort, but only one feels like coming home. And what you discover when you come home to yourself is the foundation of everything: love. Not the conditional love that depends on performance or achievement, but the unconditional love that is the very fabric of existence itself. This love isn't something you earn or attract. It's what you are. It's what everything is. This is Thoth's ultimate teaching. Beneath all the false layers, what remains is love. The same love that moves stars and grows flowers and beats your heart without your permission. You are not separate from this force. You are this force, temporarily forgetting itself in the beautiful game of being human. If this video resonated with you, let us know by commenting, "I understood it."